Hey guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. Today we're going to be taking a look at adding shadows. Now there's a lot to shadows in terms of lighting and physics, and there's a lot of things that affect the nature of the shadow. For this demonstration, I'm just going to show how we can take this image of this gal, extract her from it, and put her in this scene of this beach here. But for that to be convincing, at least to some degree, and for it to work, we have to be able to add a shadow that matches that scene. And some of the main topics we're just going to cover is how to get accurate color, obviously decreasing the luminance, and then focusing on things like geometry, as well as trying to achieve a manner of consistency with other shadows in the image. So let's get to it. So now to get started, I think especially whenever we're doing a composite of two images, it is really important to talk about image selection. And so the two images that I'm going to be using in this case are one of this gal walking along this concrete walkway, and then we're going to be placing her in this scene of this beach. Now, for this composite to have any chance of it actually kind of working out, there have to be some similarities, and some of those key similarities are like the direction of the lighting. So for example, we can see in this scene here, the lighting is pretty much coming from in front of her and shining this way, therefore casting a shadow like right below or somewhat slightly behind. But another key aspect is because there is so much of a bright surface underneath, you can see there's some bottom lighting that's occurring. And this is going to be kind of important because, as you can imagine, in a beach scene, we also have this same kind of behind, but from the top lighting, as you can see it, covered by these palm trees. But for sure, when you have just this big, bright, white, sandy area, you're going to have similarly reflection or a light source coming from below. So in that sense, we have at least some consistency here between the two images as we try to bring them together, but you'll see there's going to be a few other things we need to do to get the blending to work. So now, all I did in terms of removing the woman from her scene was just use a combination of background eraser and regular eraser. I wasn't too crazy about it, just trying to get enough so that we can put this scene together and demonstrate shadows. And it's going to take a little bit of kind of figuring out where's the right place to put her in the scene so that the scale is correct. May need to move her back, move her forward, or change the size. But for this demonstration, I'm okay with kind of this position here. And right off the bat, you can kind of tell it apart from the fact that there's no shadow, it doesn't really fit into the scene too well. So we're going to just make a few minor adjustments just to get that blend to get right, and then we'll start focusing on the shadow. So for sure, one of the first things we want to do is it's clear that she's kind of darker than the way this scene is. You can kind of imagine that these like highlights on the tops of her hands should really match like the level of brightness and luminance that's in the sand around. So we'll rename this layer subject. And then we can go to adjust brightness contrast levels, reset. And then we can, to brighten this image, just kind of grab the top or the right slider and then just bring it in. And something like that's even fine, right? Because now you kind of get this feel like the brightness is a little bit more in line with a super bright sunny day, and even the luminance of the light coming from underneath maybe matches it a little bit better. And you can tweak this till it looks the way you would want it to be. Another aspect too is you'd want to make sure it's also bright enough so that the dress seems to be lit up appropriately for being in this scene. Now, as I compare this to, the rest of the scene, it feels like the contrast might be a little bit too high, and mostly just because like the darks are probably too dark given how bright we've made it. A way we can kind of adjust that is go to adjust, brightness, contrast, highlight, midtone, and shadow. And essentially what we want to do is just kind of bring up the shadows a little bit so it's not so dark. And what that has the effect of is almost kind of like a decontrast. So then it just helps kind of, make her lighting a little bit more consistent with the rest of the scene. Don't want to go too far or else, again, we're going to have a mismatch. So maybe something like that. But then now what I would say is her skin's a little orange at this point. Not quite maybe the color that it seemed like, just because in bumping up the contrast, we have modified the saturation as a side effect. So what we can simply just do is go to Adjust, Hue and Saturation, and go to Vibrancy. And normally this tool is used to enhance or emphasize color, but in this case we can use it in our advantage to kind of bring back the color, just so it gives it a little bit more of a natural feel. So some manner of a negative number would work here. All right, so not going too crazy. I think for now that's good enough just to get her a little bit more consistent with the scene. And now we can focus on creating the shadow. So given the geometry of what we see in this scene right now and what we can kind of expect in terms of the way the shadow should be, we have a situation where the shape of the subject can be used to at least reasonably create the geometry for the shadow. There are definitely other situations where if the subject is side lit, for example, you can't rely on the shape of the subject to be representative of the shadow. And I think this is something is a problem that is pretty common, just because trying to select the object and create a shadow from it is convenient, but from a geometry standpoint, the shape doesn't really match. So you really have to kind of think about that as you're considering whether you should use this technique. But in this specific context, using the shape will get us close enough. So given the fact that everything is pretty much transparent except for the subject, what I can do is I can use the magic wand and I can set the mode to contiguous, and I want to change the match mode to opacity, because everything that I don't care about is transparent and everything I do care about is opaque. So opacity is a great selection match mode for me. Now, when I click anywhere but the subject and I kind of look at it, the selection looks pretty good, but clearly when I did my separation of the subject from her background, I didn't do a great job. There's like a lot of little strays, and there's probably some pixels that just aren't really transparent somewhere along here. But it's okay. But if I wanted to make that selection a little bit better, all I have to do is increase the tolerance much more significantly, and then only the pixels that really are not transparent are going to be selected. And again, this shape just has to be close, because really it's just going to be a shadow, so it doesn't have to be like pristine and precise and all that kind of stuff like that. So we have our selection. But really what we want to select is the subject. So even though it was a lot easier to click out here, what we can do is go to Selections and Invert. So now it's only selecting the subject and nothing else. And next what I want to do is create a new raster layer and then change my tool to Fill. And then what we want to do here is select a color that's kind of representative of the sky. I would say, mentally it would be simple to just use the color picker tool and like pick a color in the sky, but honestly I have not found that worked as I would have expected. So I'm going to use like a more pastel kind of a blue color, but we'll talk about how you can adjust that depending on your scene. But this kind of a color seems to work well for me, and I'll explain. You'll see later why this color matters. So we will use the fill tool and fill inside that selection. And then we can turn the selection off. And let's rename this layer Shadow Color. And then we will use the pick tool. And this is kind of a geometry step. We're just going to take the top one and actually drag it past the bottom, which is going to have the effect of inverting the shape, which is what we want, because when you think about it, a shadow in this context is going to be mirrored. Now we're going to zoom in here a little bit and kind of talk about this. So One thing to keep in mind is that, really there should be a shadow that goes from the front leg all the way out, right? But our shape is really kind of based on the back leg, just because that's the lowest part of the subject. So we're gonna, make some assumptions here. We're gonna kind of cheat a little bit, and I'm gonna drag the shadow color below our subject, and then just kind of drag this forward a little bit. So now you're seeing, it's kind of like it's now having that effect of like the full, from front leg to back, we have a relatively close shadow. And if you really wanted to, you could kind of do some hand painting to make this a little bit more accurate. But while we're on the subject of sort of like how this thing is shaped, one thing you have to consider is the geometry of the flooring, right? So you can think of this as sort of like a flat plane coming at us, right? And so that shadow is going to trail, but the length of this shadow should be somewhat proportional to her height, as you would kind of gauge the length of this shadow being proportional to the height of this tree. So, and again, some of it you could try to be mathematical about it, but other aspects, I think it's more just what kind of looks right is close enough to go with here. Now, there's a few other things you could do here if you really are needing to, if you really want to try to add a little bit more detail. I'm going to skip them just for the sake of time, but one of them is to, if you have a much wider lens, for example, and so then you have a much more dramatic perspective, a vanishing point perspective, or if your shadow is much longer in length, you may need to switch to perspective mode and do some adjustments where you're like expanding the side that is closer to you, so your shadow has much more of like a trapezoidal shape. I'm not going to get into that here. I honestly don't feel like it really helps in this particular case. But that's something to consider. Another aspect too, since the ground is like, a wobbly sand, kind of a shape, you could go to the lengths of creating a displacement effect on the shadow so that it doesn't have this perfect sort of matching of the shape of the woman. But I'm not going to cover that here. I have another video that covers displacement maps, and so if you really want to get to that level, you just want to kind of insert that set of steps here. So now that we've covered geometry in terms of the shadow, next what we want to focus on is sort of like the color, but also more the consistency of this shadow with the other shadows. If we can make it consistent, then it'll sell a lot more in terms of her really fitting into the image from that point of view. And I will also say, if you're going to get to this step, you'll want to make sure you've really figured out all the geometry stuff, because it gets a lot harder after you've done this to make adjustments to geometry once you start going down these next steps, because we are going to duplicate this layer. So that being said, let's duplicate this shadow color layer and let's rename it Shadow Darken. And then what we want to do is we want to, with the Shadow Darken layer selected, go to Brightness, Contrast, and then drag it all the way down so it pretty much just becomes black. And then we want to drag that underneath the shadow color, and then let's turn the shadow color visibility off. So Shadow Darken layer is selected. We want to change its blend mode to burn. And then we want to start dialing back the opacity. And what you'll notice now is it kind of brings out the detail of that sand a little bit more, right? So it's kind of like, hey, look, I'm starting to create a shadow, but it doesn't really look right because we've darkened it, but we've modified the contrast so much that it just doesn't really look like it fits, right? But then now we turn on our shadow color layer back on, and we select that layer and we start dialing that one back as well. And now you can start to see how, as those two layers kind of play together, you get something that looks a little bit more like what the original shadow is. And it takes a little bit of tweaking, right? There's a little bit of, you are going to have to kind of jump between the two and kind of see, like, Do I need more, or less of the overlay, and do I need more or less of the shadow, or I mean of the color? And as you're kind of, working through this, you want to settle on something that, just looks like how you like. And there may be cases where, like I said, I started with this color with some foreknowledge that this color works pretty well in terms of trying to match this. But if if the color you start with doesn't match your scene, since this is just basically a solid color fill, you can easily go to adjust hue, saturation, and colorize if you wanted to change what that hue was, and then try to see if you can get it to match your scene better. Now, I feel like my hue matches, so I'm not going to mess with it, but perhaps like I want this overarchingly to be darker without the overlay modifying the contrast. Just as well with the color layer selected, I can go to brightness, contrast, and then maybe just bring it down a little bit, and maybe that's going to get me a little bit more matching between those two. So now, I'll call that close enough at this stage. And then just because, this, especially when zoomed in, this has a much, sharper kind of feel to it. You could apply some blur. And in this case, because the shadows are still fairly sharp, since this is a harsh light source, this is the sunlight, we're only going to do just like a little bit of blur. We're not going to go full scale a Gaussian blur. Like we can just get away with doing adjust blur and maybe like blur more. And you'll want to kind of do it on both, right? On both the shadow color and the darken, but that can also be just another point of exploration for you to try to tweak it to get it to the level that you really want. Now, one final thing I do want to mention here is I feel like it doesn't, like there's still some aspects of it that even with a shadow that has like a very similar color and, the geometry being at least somewhat, representative, there's still some aspect of it that doesn't quite fit for me. And I think it mostly has to do with this leg in the back here, and that, when you see this level of luminance, you get this sort of sense in your mind of like how dark that is. But it doesn't feel like this leg kind of matches with that it's like there's so much lighting, I guess, around in her original scene that it just really lit up this leg, even though if it were fully covered in shadow, given the lighting angle that we've created, this leg should be darker. So what we can do is above the very top layer, we can create a new raster layer and select like a dark gray and change the blend mode to darken, and then kind of like bring it, I don't know, we'll say halfway. We'll probably bring it down even further. And just get like the standard paintbrush, standard brush style, maybe lower, mid-level hardness or so. And then we'll just kind of like loosely paint over here. And then you'll see how we'll dial that back a little bit, but so just kind of like darken the leg to a degree that matches, makes the leg a little bit more matching of the shadow. And so now that we've kind of like darkened that, we can take our eraser, and we want a pretty decent size here and a low hardness because we want this to kind of blend very nicely. Like we don't want this to be like a harsh shadow. So if we kind of make a large size and then just start like dialing this back a little bit, then we can see that, okay, so now at least we're not seeing this like harsh line of where the leg is. However, now we can increase the hardness and then just kind of clean up around the edges, just so that we're not affecting the sand along with the leg. And if it feels like it's a little bit too strong, you can always use the opacity to kind of dial it back. And so that's it for this one. As you can see, there's a lot of, minor but, technical aspects to it. You really have to kind of think about what things don't sit well with you in terms of, how the shadow is going. But you have to factor in things like geometry and color and consistency with other shadows. This, I'm not going to say that this is the best and most convincing composite of trying to put someone in one scene into the other, but it just provided at least an avenue to demonstrate this concept of some details to focus on when you're trying to create shadows. As always, if you have any questions or would like to suggest content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of new videos that I post, click the subscribe button, and you can check the video description for ways to support and engage the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.